Welcome to the second video of Chapter 1, where we will look at the learning question, what are the domains of child development? And we will look at some reoccurring themes and issues in the field. So let's begin with domains of development. And there are three primary domains of development: physical development, cognitive development, and social emotional development. So we will be covering each of these domains in different chapters. We'll certainly look at how the body and the brain change from, prenatal development through infancy and toddlerhood, and then early childhood and middle and later childhood and into adolescence. There are obviously major changes physically that go on in both the body and the brain throughout those periods, including things like neurotransmitter levels in the brain and changes in the hormone system. And so anything biological is in that area. In cognitive development, we're looking at how we think and reason and understand and use logic. And we'll look at a number of theories concerning cognitive development in a later chapter. And this area includes things like memory, language, problem solving, decision making, etc. I mean, anything that has to do with your thinking. Social emotional development has to do with connecting to others, relationships, and also, understanding emotions and controlling emotions. So we'll look at such things as attachment, friendships, impulse control as part of your social emotional development. And we'll also look at things like how emotions change throughout development. So anyways, these are three different domains, and although we're going to be covering them separately, I want you to think about and consider how they interact with each other. When something changes in one of these areas, it affects the other two domains as well. Sometimes in small ways, sometimes in larger ways. When you get to the second discussion board, there is a question that asks you to come up with examples of interactions between these three domains. So I'm not going to give you examples now because I want you to think about it and discuss it when you get to the second discussion board. I guess I'll give you an example from later in life and just use myself as an example. So you can't use this because I want you to talk about childhood development. But one change in my life has been, the settling into a more stable long-term marriage with my current wife. I had in many ways, a very chaotic life. I moved a lot, had a lot of different jobs, had 2 divorces in the past. But now I'm in the longest relationship ever, and that's a social emotional change. And it's really caused changes in how I think about things. I'm much less anxious than I ever was in life. I'm much more content and calm, and so I think very differently about life now. And it also affected me physically because my current wife, who I've been with for over 10 years now, I mean, she loves to cook for me, and so I've gotten fatter since I settled into this stable relationship. Anyways, that's an example from later in life, but think about how these different domains interact with one another. Okay, there are a number of different ages and different stages that we cover in developmental psychology, and these are the categories we'll mainly be concentrating on in this class, and not so much adolescence, but we will at times touch adolescent development. this book is organized according to different themes. And as I go through how things change during childhood, sometimes I will also, get a little bit into adolescence and talk about the same theme. Um, so these are very standard stages that get looked at in all developmental courses. Infancy. I mean, actually, we should even have an initial stage of prenatal development. We will be talking about that. So, what changes and develops prenatally before you're even born. Then we'll look at infancy, which is the first year of life. Toddlerhood from about 1 to 3. Early childhood is 3 to 6, and you will often hear me refer to the preschool years, which means I'm talking about the early childhood period. When I talk about the elementary school years, I'm talking about middle childhood. It's often referred to as middle and late childhood from about 6 until puberty. Here it says 12 here, but really it ends whenever the individual reaches puberty. And even I say it's called middle and late childhood in many textbooks, but they don't separate the two. They just kind of merge together, middle to late childhood. Um, Adolescence is from puberty, whenever that happens. So just using the age 12 here as a possible time for puberty, um, up until about 18 or so. The adolescent ages aren't set in stone. I mean, um, different textbooks will refer to different age categories there. I'm just going to add on um, the the next stages. If you were to look at lifespan development, after adolescence, there's a stage now called emerging adulthood, which runs from about 18 to 25. And this is a new stage that's been added um, in developmental psychology, and it's because we take longer now to reach true adulthood than we used to in past generations. And this is mainly because of economics more than anything. It used to be back when I was younger that you could be expected to leave home at, you know, 18 or 19 or 20 and be self-sufficient. There were enough jobs available that people could live on, already when you're 19 or 20. Um, it was there were so many, different types of manual labor jobs available that there were always jobs available for those who wanted them, and um, and that you could support yourself on them. It's not quite the same now. So people live at home longer than in past generations, and more people are going to college than ever before. And so it's kind of like there's been an extension past adolescence, which is why this emerging adulthood category has been, or stage has formed. It's kind of like an extension of adolescence. You're not quite an adult yet. You're not quite self-sufficient, but you're on your way there. Between 18 and 25. And then we have the adult categories of early, middle, and later adulthood. Um, just roughly, early adulthood is like your 20s and 30s. Middle adulthood is like your 40s and 50s, and later adulthood is kind of like 60 plus. Okay, but we will certainly concentrate on the childhood years in this class. Okay, we're going to go through some issues, kind of issues in the field of child development, and the first one is an issue that's been discussed um, forever. I mean, I say forever, but I mean we can go back to the time of you know uh, Aristotle and Plato and the early philosophers, and they talked about the issue of nature and nurture, and is it do we become who we are because of our biology and our inheritance from our parents in the way of genes, or is it because of nurture, which is the caregiving that you receive and the experiences that you have in life. And and so one of the questions in discussion board two asks you, which is more important? Which do you think is more important, nature or nurture? Um, I would tell you one answer that now is that, you know, although it's been debated for hundreds of years which one is more important. I mean, we now basically take the view in developmental psychology that it's it doesn't really make sense to say one's more important than the other. They interact constantly together. So it's not like they're not even like separate things really. They're all of your experiences that you have, your caregiving that you receive, and the schools you go to, and your friendships, and your the quality of the neighborhood you grew up in. I mean, all these nurture experiences, they're all interpreted by you based on your genetics and your the biology that helped to form your brain in the first place. And so they constantly work together, these two things. But I still will be asking you which you think is more important in the second discussion board. Okay. Um, the second issue here is continuous versus stage-like development. And I'm going to go to the whiteboard real quick here, where I just made a few notes about this. So just concentrate right now on the left side of the whiteboard here. So continuous development refers to development that is quantitative in nature. That and what I mean by that is the development happens in a steady, continuous fashion. So um, in nature, think about something like the growth of a tree. From the time it's a sapling, it already looks like a miniature tree, and then throughout all the decades and decades that a tree will grow, it basically never changes its form. It gets bigger, there are more branches, it gets thicker, it gets more leaves, but a 5-year-old tree doesn't look significantly different than a 25-year-old tree. I mean, it's just different in size. Every year it grows a little bit more. It, has a few more leaves and uh, thicker branches, etc. But it's continuous development. It goes from small tree to bigger tree to bigger tree to bigger tree, and that so when when theories take the viewpoint that some type of development is continuous in nature, we call these incremental theories, meaning that it just changes in a standard way, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And one example are information processing theories that help to explain your cognitive development. And they take the approach that there are little changes that are happening in the brain year after year throughout childhood and adolescence, and that cause your thinking to change a little bit at a time. So each year you're a little bit smarter. You think a little bit more logically. You can perform some extra types of um, maneuvers of information in your brain, and it's based on the fact that your working memory gets a little bit larger as you develop, a little bit at a time, and your the speed of processing in your brain gets a little bit faster year after year. So it's like small continuous changes cause your cognition to change, your thinking. Now, stage like development, on the other hand, says that it's not continuous, steady change. It says that stage like development is that we go through a series of stages. Like think of, like steps, picture some steps that you're kind of at one level for a while, and then all of a sudden you kind of jump up to another level, where you make what's called a qualitative change. You're not just more or bigger. You change in the quality of the process that we're looking at. It's easier to use an example. Think about a tadpole to a frog. a tadpole doesn't just become more tadpole or a bigger tadpole. It goes through a qualitative change. It turns into a frog. I mean, you look at the two and they don't seem that related. So that's a qualitative change. It's a stage change, or like a caterpillar to a butterfly. It's the butterfly doesn't look anything like a caterpillar. It's not more caterpillar or bigger caterpillar. It has made a qualitative shift. So stage, like we the theories that have stages, we call them stage theories. So not surprisingly, and they say that we kind of jump from one stage to another. It's not just continuous slow growth. And so Piaget's cognitive development theory is an example. And this is in the same area as I was talking about. Information processing is explaining your change in thinking and cognition, um, by using by talking about incremental change. But for the same thing, the development of your cognition, Piaget suggests that we go through stages where we reach certain points and we kind of leap and shift to a whole new way of thinking about the world, and develop new thinking skills. And he uses these stages to explain that how, like, a 9-year-old, they don't just think, um, they don't just think faster than a 3-year-old, or they don't just have more knowledge than a 3-year-old. They think completely differently about the world than a 3-year-old does. And he explains that we go through a number of stages that affect how we think. And we'll cover these. You don't have to know them well now. We'll cover them in a later chapter. But anyways, there are different, some of our domains of change are better explained by continuous development, some by stage-like development. Okay, let me go back. Here we are. And let me go to this picture here, just to kind of finish off that point. I mean, here we have a bunch of uh, children and some adolescents lined up, by age. And what you can see is that throughout most of childhood, uh, physical growth is very quantitative. It's very continuous. If you can kind of draw a line from the heads of one child to the next, and if you go from left to right, I mean, you can see that it's not a perfectly straight line, but basically, there's a little bit more growth each year, and it's pretty steady. It's almost like a straight line from across the top of their heads until you get to the last few. And so for much of our development throughout, like, early childhood and the elementary school years, growth is considered a quantitative change. You grow a couple of inches, 2 or 3 inches each year, pretty slow and steady. Then all of a sudden we hit puberty, and if you continue that line and get to the last few, you can see that all of a sudden the line starts, like, going upwards. It starts curving upwards, because puberty is like a new stage. So all of a sudden growth that was continuous and quantitative now becomes the qualitative shift. We don't just gain another 2 or 3 inches. All of a sudden we gain a ton of height within a few years of when we undergo puberty. So sometimes it depends what years you look at, whether something's more of a continuous growth pattern or more stage-like. Okay, returning to this list here, the third issue is stability versus change. And this issue has to do with do we stay the same people over time, or do we reinvent ourselves along the way? Um, you know, and so how stable is our personality traits and our temperament and um, our behaviors? Do they change from one year to another, or do we tend to remain the same people? And excuse me, I'm going to go to a picture just to kind of illustrate this concept a little bit. And um, one thing that research shows is that anxiety, shyness, and aggression tend to be relatively stable traits. Shyness, anxiety, and aggression tend to be relatively stable traits, but how we express them um, tends to change over time. So the traits are somewhat stable, but we express them in different ways, which represents change. This particular graph here is looking at physical aggression. It's just studying physical aggression, and you can see it's a longitudinal study, which means that they studied the same groups over a number of years. And at 6 years of age, which is over on the left side of the graph, they had subjects that they rated as being highly physical aggressive at the age of 6, moderately physically aggressive, or low physical aggression. And then they followed them to see how stable or changing these physical aggression traits were. And you can see that if you look at the bottom two, the moderate and the low curves, I mean, they're both fairly stable. You can see some real stability. I mean, the moderate starts to go down a little bit gradually, and the low kind of slopes downwards throughout. But more or less, there's not any major changes in the low or moderate groups. And we can see that the level of physical aggression tends to remain fairly stable. But then when we look at the high physical aggression group, that graph changes much more radically. It starts by it's going up. As we get into later childhood, their aggression levels are rising somewhat overall, and then all of a sudden it kind of plummets down um, as we get into early adolescence. Uh, and that would suggest that this is something that can change over time. This physical aggression. Uh, just to explain what's actually happening here, I mean, the truth is that aggression is a um, fairly stable trait. But just looking at physical aggression, we see change happening. This is because if you think about how aggression gets displayed at different ages, younger children tend to act out on aggressive impulses. So they will push others, or maybe at younger ages even kick them, or they might get into fights. Or as we get older, that aggression often gets channeled into other forms. Younger adolescents are less likely to be physically aggressive and more likely to be verbally aggressive, or do what's called relationship aggression, which is manipulating relationships. So this high declining group, the physical aggression actually does decline, but when we look at the results closer, it turns out that their overall aggression levels aren't really changing. They tend to be much more stable than this graph um, suggests, and it just that the form of how they express the aggression actually is what changes. And so, if you were to actually look at other forms of aggression, you would see that the line doesn't actually go down that much. So, anyways, once again, I just want to point out that sometimes what you're particularly looking at will affect whether something looks more stable or looks like it changes more. And so you often need to be very careful about what variables you're studying. Overall aggression doesn't really change, but how you express it turns out it does change. Anyways, this is the issue of stability and change. How much do our characteristics change over time? And we will see examples throughout the textbook that certain things are very stable and don't change radically from one period of development to the next. Other things are more likely to change. Another issue is individual differences. And the scientific research that we will be looking at throughout the text tends to identify general principles that describe the average or typical development patterns. but it's very important that we also study the exceptions and that we recognize that they exist. So for everything I say, like, when we look at a graph like this, for instance, I mean, individual members of these groups may show very different patterns than what's shown here. You may say, I know somebody that started off with, they would have been in the low aggressive group, and then they got very aggressive when they got to adolescence. And so, yeah, individual patterns won't always follow the group pattern. So we always have to keep in mind that there are individual differences and that the average results don't apply to everyone. But we tend to study large groups, like we get a lot of subjects and we look at what are the typical or average results. So for instance, um, we will see results showing that if you grow up in poverty, that there are very typical negative effects on development. Um, Things like more chance. We saw some of them in the videos. Actually, there's more chance of later drug dependency. There's more chance of dropping out of school. The research has shown that you're less likely to have stable relationships, and there's a lot of long-term negative effects of growing up in poverty. But you know what? It's important to study the individual differences because it turns out that some children are particularly resilient, and studying the individual differences led to the topic of resiliency, and that some individuals can overcome very adverse beginnings in life and still do very well in life and show very positive developmental pathways and developmental results. So we will always try to keep in mind that individual differences exist. And so when I tell you some result or give you the results of a study, just because they might not apply to you or somebody does not discount the results. It just means that you may know somebody that doesn't fit the typical pattern. Okay, there's a few more issues. The next one is the role of the child, and this issue is about, did do you feel like you chose to be who you are, that it was your own doing that led to who you are now, or do you feel like others made really shaped you and made you into who you are? This is the issue of the role of the child as being active or passive. So um, some theorists believe in that children are very active in their own development. Piaget is one of them. He believes that, like, for instance, that children discover knowledge on their own. He never thought it was really important to really even to do too much teaching of children. He felt that children would discover knowledge on their own just by interacting with the environment. So the child is very active in their own cognitive development. Vygotsky also took a viewpoint of an active child. He said that learning is a collaborative process between the child and more experienced adults or peers, but it's a collaborative process, a back and forth process. It's not that the experienced peer or the adult is filling the child's head with knowledge or just teaching them everything they have to know. It's a back and forth process. Um, they talked about this in one of the videos as when he mentioned the concept of reciprocal relationships, volley and serve. He mentioned some term like that, like it's a back and forth. And so once again, the child is active in their own development. They're making choices that affect who they become. Now, there are theories that take more the role, that believe that the child's role is much more passive, and this the major one that comes to mind is behaviorism. The behaviorism sees the child as being a passive recipient to others, to others and to environmental forces that just kind of shape the child into who they become, and that the role, the child doesn't really have any role in their own development. Okay, and we will be looking at all these theories in the next chapter, behaviorism, Piaget, Vygotsky. So don't worry too much now about knowing them exactly. I'm sure you heard about them in 101, but uh, I would say currently most people believe more in Piaget and Vygotsky, that children are very active in determining their own development and who they become. The next issue is positive psychology, and I would say that since about the late 1990s or so, just over for a little over 20 years, psychologists have moved. They've moved away from the old disease model of looking at humans. And the disease model, what I mean by that is that psychology really used to concentrate on looking at problems and how to fix them. That was psychology's major role. What could go wrong in development? What are the negative outcomes? How can we prevent these negative outcomes of children becoming delinquents when they reach adolescence, or I don't know, uh, children dropping out, becoming high school dropouts. I mean, like, it was like or becoming depressed, or it was psychology used to be focused on the problems that can occur in development. And positive psychology kind of flipped that around. Once again, it's just been really kind of at the forefront for the last 20 to 25 years. And what positive psychology does is look at human strengths, not what could go wrong, but what should we be striving towards? What are the good qualities of being human, and good qualities that we should be trying to reach for and develop our children towards. So things like studying courage or optimism, perseverance, insight, creativity, resilience, happiness. They finally started studying happiness. I mean, uh, depression has been studied for the whole history of psychology, but it's only been lately that people studied happiness. How do you become happy? So this is about positive outcomes and how to get to them, rather than try to prevent negative outcomes. And it's been a real shift in psychology and in developmental psychology, but in psychology as a whole. Okay, one last issue is the issue of equifinality versus multifinality. And I'm going to go to the whiteboard again, where I've made a few notes here. So, um, so equifinality is the principle by which different developmental pathways may result in the same outcome. And this is expressed by the saying, there's no one right way to raise a child. So, I mean, we always have positive outcomes in mind for our children, um, or at least most of the time we do, as parents or as caregivers. And so let's say, um, there's two families, and they both want their children to grow up to be um, dependable and responsible. And one set of parents may believe that the only way to raise a child that's going to become dependable and responsible is to make sure that you use a lot of physical punishment, for instance, and that you need to punish things that they're doing wrong, and spank them, or use other forms of punishment, and that if you don't, they will become bratty and irresponsible, and 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 so they're trying to get to a positive outcome using punishment. Another family may not believe in punishment at all, but they have the same outcome in mind. They want a dependable, responsible child, and they feel like by explaining things to the child more, and teaching the child to do right rather than punishing them when they do wrong. They may do a completely different method, And it's possible that both, you know, both sets of parents may end up raising children that are dependable and responsible. I mean, there's not only one pathway that leads to a certain outcome. And that's what equifinality is all about. There are a lot of different pathways that can lead to the same kind of outcome. Whether the outcome's positive or negative, there are multiple pathways to get there. Multifinality is a little bit of the opposite concept, of the principle by which the same pathways may lead to different developmental outcomes. An example would be that victims of abuse may have an outcome of depression, which is one of the most expected outcomes. If we know that a child has gone through some years of abuse, I mean, we often expect that the depression is in their future, because it is a pretty standard outcome, but it turns out it's not always the outcome. And it's not, and that there are children that are much more resilient, that end up having, going through personal growth due to their hardships, and then they go through a healing process. And not that we ever want those kind of hardships for a child, but there are positive outcomes that can come from adverse, negative pathways. So that the same pathway, two different children that go through, let's say, abuse, or two different children grow up in poverty, let's say. I mean, they may end up with very, very different outcomes later in life. And growing up in poverty may make one child strong and stronger, whereas another child it cripples. So that is a multifinality, many different outcomes, even based on the same kinds of beginnings and the same pathways that they experienced. Okay, so that will conclude the second video and the second section of chapter 1. I will talk to you again when you watch the third video.